The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in late October, carried by a boy no older than 12, who knocked twice on the peeling front door of the Kingswell house and left before anyone thought to tip him. Florence found it on the hallway floor, half tucked beneath the welcome mat, as though whoever slid it there had second thoughts. She almost didn't read it. She had learned over the past year that letters with formal seals rarely carried good news for people like them. She turned it over in her hands. The wax bore an embossed L, clean, deliberate, and carved with the kind of precision that only comes from old money and older habits. She recognized the seal before she recognized the name printed beneath it in sharp black ink. Victor Langford. The name alone was enough to silence a room. Florence set the letter on the kitchen table and stood very still for a moment. The morning light came through the single east-facing window in thin lines, pale and cold, the way October light always fell in Briarwood, Pennsylvania, as if the sun itself was uncertain about staying. She listened for her father. She heard nothing. That, in itself, told her everything. She opened the letter. It was not long. Men like Victor Langford did not waste words. The language was precise, the sentences short, the tone entirely without warmth. He proposed, though proposed was far too soft a word for what the letter actually said, a formal arrangement between their two families, a contractual union to be reviewed and signed no later than the first Friday of November, giving her exactly 9 days to consider. The terms included the immediate settlement of the Kingswell family's outstanding debts Florence had only recently learned the full weight of, along with the preservation of the Kingswell name in any future business dealings, provided the union produced a lawful heir within 3 years. He did not call it a marriage proposal. He called it a matter of practical necessity. Florence read the letter twice. Then she folded it with great care, as one folds something that might be needed again as evidence, and placed it inside the front cover of the household ledger, where she kept every bill, every past due notice, and every receipt she had not yet been able to honor. She did not tell her father that morning. She had known the Langford name all her life, the way everyone in Briarwood knew it, distantly, the way you know the shape of a mountain, without ever having stood at its base. Victor Langford had inherited the Langford Steelworks from his father at 24, turned a regional operation into one of the largest industrial enterprises in the northeastern United States, and had, in the years since, expanded into rail contracts, coal rights, and a banking partnership that made him, by most estimations, the second wealthiest man in Pennsylvania, and the most powerful in Briarwood by a considerable margin. He had been married once. Briefly, the first, Mrs. Langford, had died of fever in the second year of their marriage, and the Langford household had been without a mistress for nearly 7 years since. Florence was not naive enough to believe she was the first name on his list. She had met him exactly once, at the Hargrove Winter Assembly 2 seasons ago. He had not spoken to her directly. He had looked at her once from across the room, a long, even look, the kind that does not smile, and then turned back to his companions without apparent interest. She had thought nothing of it at the time. Men like Victor Langford looked at everything as though assessing its value and finding it acceptable, but unremarkable. She had told herself she had not thought about that look since. That had not been entirely true. Her father's name was Arthur Kingswell, and he had been one of Briarwood's more respected merchants for most of Florence's childhood. He had built his dry goods business from nothing, raised Florence alone after her mother's death from consumption when Florence was 11, and sent her to the Harrow Academy for Young Ladies in Philadelphia for 3 years, an expense he could not actually afford, but could not bring himself to reduce. The trouble had begun 2 years ago with a bad harvest season, then a rail line rerouting that cut off their primary suppliers, then a fire at the secondary warehouse that the insurance underwriter, who turned out to be a cousin of a man Arthur had publicly disputed in a contract negotiation, refused to cover in full. Debt compounded on debt the way debt does when there is nothing to absorb the weight of it, and by the spring of the current year, the Kingswell family owed more to more creditors than Florence could pretend away in the ledger. She had been managing the books since she was 16. She understood exactly how bad it was. She also understood, when she reread Victor Langford's letter that afternoon, while her father slept upstairs in a fitful midday rest that had become his habit since the humiliation of the third unpaid bill, that the letter was not truly addressed to Arthur Kingswell. It was addressed to her. Langford knew, with the kind of knowing that powerful men accumulate through their networks and their watchers, and their careful attention to the movements of smaller lives, that it was Florence who kept the books. Florence, who met with the creditors, Florence, who had twice gone to the Briarwood Merchants' Bank herself, a thing women of her station did not do, a thing that was noticed and discussed and eventually admired, quietly, by the men who thought they were the only ones who noticed anything. He had not written to the father. He had written to the daughter, because she was the one who would understand the contract. 9 days. Florence spent 3 of them saying nothing. She helped her father with breakfast, walked to the market on Elm Street, reviewed the books in the evenings and said nothing. She was very good at saying nothing. It was one of the skills her mother had never had the chance to teach her, and that she had consequently been forced to teach herself. On the 4th day she wrote a reply. She did not accept. She did not decline. She requested a meeting. She kept the tone measured, her sentences no longer than his had been. She specified a time, 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. She specified a location, the Langford offices on Main and 2nd, because she would not have this conversation in her own kitchen, in a house with peeling paint and a father who might overhear and misunderstand the nature of what was being negotiated. She sealed the letter herself. She walked it to the post herself. She stood at the postal counter and paid the stamp from her own pocket and watched it taken away with the morning collection. Then she walked home in the October cold, her coat pulled tight at the collar, her chin level, her expression giving away nothing. She was afraid. She was also something else, something she had no precise word for, a steadiness that sat just beneath the fear, like bedrock beneath soft ground. One name had started all of this. She intended to find out what it would cost to carry it. That Friday, a second letter arrived, not from Victor Langford this time, from his attorney. It contained a single line. The terms had been revised. The 3-year clause was no longer the most pressing condition. There was now a deadline attached to the debt, 60 days before the Kingswell property transferred to a holding company whose registered owner was, on every document, an intermediary, and on a separate page attached without comment was the name of the holding company. Florence read the name. She read it again. She set the letter down very slowly. The holding company was Langford. He had not waited for her reply. He had already moved. The Langford offices occupied the entire 3rd floor of a building on the corner of Main and 2nd that had been constructed 17 years prior, with the specific intention of impressing people who already had money and intimidating people who did not. Florence had walked past it dozens of times. She had never had cause to enter. She arrived at precisely 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, which was itself a kind of statement. She wore her best dress, deep charcoal wool high collar, the one she had repaired twice at the left sleeve, and repaired well enough that no one would notice unless they were looking. She had her hair pinned with her mother's tortoise-shell comb, the only piece of her mother's things she had not considered selling. She carried no handbag, only a small leather folder tucked under her arm that contained the original letter, the attorney's addendum, and 3 pages of figures she had spent 2 nights preparing. The man at the front desk looked at her with the expression men at front desks always gave her, polite, faintly puzzled, waiting for her to explain herself. She gave her name. He asked if she had an appointment. She said she had requested one, and received no reply declining it, which she had chosen to interpret as confirmation. There was a pause. He disappeared up a staircase. She stood in the lobby and did not look at the portraits on the wall, or the brass fittings on the banister, or any of the things that were clearly there to remind visitors of the weight of the Langford name. She looked straight ahead, at the far wall, at nothing in particular, and kept her breathing even. She was shown upstairs 4 minutes later. The office itself was large without being ostentatious, which Florence found more unsettling than opulence would have been. Opulence was a performance, and performances had seams you could find if you looked carefully enough. This room had no seams, dark wood paneling, a desk that was almost aggressively uncluttered, 2 chairs positioned in front of it at an angle that was just slightly less comfortable than it should have been. Deliberate, she thought. Everything in this room was deliberate. Victor Langford was standing at the window when she entered. He turned when she came in, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He was taller than she remembered from the Hargrove assembly, or perhaps she simply hadn't been standing close enough to him then to understand the full fact of his presence. Dark suit, no ornamentation. His face was the kind that did not offer much, not unkind, not warm, simply contained. Like a door that had been closed for so long the hinges had forgotten how to move freely. He gestured to the chair without greeting her. She sat. She placed the leather folder in her lap and folded her hands over it and met his eyes. He sat across from her on the other side of the desk, and regarded her for a moment with the same even, assessing look she remembered from 2 years ago. Then he said without preamble, "You brought documents." "I did," Florence said. "You reviewed the terms, both sets of them," she said, "including the amendment your attorney delivered on Friday, which I noticed arrived before you could have received my reply." Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible. Not quite surprise, but the shadow of it, contained immediately. The amendment was prepared in anticipation of a range of responses. "In anticipation," Florence repeated. "And the holding company, a precaution. Against what, precisely?" He looked at her for a moment. "Against delay," he said. Florence opened the leather folder. She removed the 3 pages of figures and set them on the edge of his desk. Not pushed across it, not placed timidly, simply set there with the quiet confidence of someone presenting something that had taken real work to produce. "I have prepared a summary of the outstanding Kingswell obligations," she said, "including the original principal, the accrued interest as of this month, and the realistic timeline for independent resolution given current income." She paused. "The realistic timeline is not favorable." He glanced at the pages. He did not pick them up immediately, which told her he had already seen figures of his own. "I am aware of the obligations," he said. "Then you're aware that the arrangement you've proposed provides you with very little that you do not already have access to through conventional acquisition." The silence that followed was brief and very precise. "Conventional acquisition," he said, "would require a probate process that takes a minimum of 8 months and generates the kind of public record that is not in anyone's interest." He leaned back in his chair slightly, the only relaxed movement she had seen from him. "This arrangement is cleaner. For you, for both families." Florence looked at him steadily. "What you are describing," she said, "is a transaction in which you settle a debt in exchange for a wife you don't require romantically, a name that carries social utility in certain circles where your industrial reputation is considered coarse, and access to a property on Elm Street that has been in the Kingswell family for 31 years, and which you intend, I suspect, to use as collateral for a rail line easement through the southern end of Briarwood that your engineers have been surveying since August." The silence this time was longer. Victor Langford looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, and that alone was interesting, because she had become quite good at reading expressions. "You've been paying attention," he said. "I've been paying attention to the surveyors," she said. "Everyone in that neighborhood has. We simply drew different conclusions about what it meant." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The easement is one component. I'd like it named explicitly in the contract." He studied her. "That's not a customary request." "No," Florence agreed. "But I expect our arrangement is not entirely customary." They spoke for 40 minutes more. He was not what she had expected, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it, at least privately. She had expected dismissal, the polite, efficient kind that powerful men deployed when they had already decided the outcome of a meeting and were simply waiting for the other party to catch up. She had not expected him to listen. Not with warmth, not with any softness whatsoever, but with a particular quality of attention that felt, disconcertingly, like respect. The kind extended not because it was owed, but because it had been earned in real time, in that room, in those 40 minutes. He did not agree to all of her revisions. He agreed to 3 of the 5 she proposed. The easement clause, the explicit exclusion of the Kingswell family name from any future debt liability post-union, and a provision allowing her father to remain in the house on Elm Street as a permanent resident regardless of any subsequent property transfers. The other 2 he declined without explanation. She did not press. She had gone in expecting to secure 2. 3 was a result she had not allowed herself to anticipate. When they had finished, he stood, which signaled the meeting's end, and she stood as well and gathered her papers. At the door she paused, not for effect, simply because the question had been in her mind for the past hour, and she saw no reason to leave without it answered. "Why me?" she asked. "There are women in this city with better names, better connections, and fewer complications." Victor Langford looked at her from behind his desk. For the first time since she had entered the room, the expression on his face was something she could not categorize at all. Not warmth, not calculation, something between them, or perhaps something entirely different from both. "Because they would have accepted the original terms," he said. Florence held his gaze for exactly 1 moment. Then she nodded, once, and left. The first weeks inside the Langford household were an education in a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of absence, Victor Langford was often present, more present than she had anticipated. He took his breakfast at the same hour every morning, 6:45, no variation, at the east end of the long dining table. He read correspondence while he ate. He did not speak unless spoken to at that hour, and Florence, who had enough experience with men who needed their morning routines respected, did not speak either. They ate in silence that was not precisely uncomfortable, but was not comfortable either. It was simply silence, the way weather is simply weather, impersonal, consistent, and not designed with anyone's feelings in mind. She had been given her own rooms, which she had expected, and her own schedule, which she had not expected to be as unrestricted as it turned out to be. She had imagined more governance over her movements, instructions about which calls to receive, which social engagements to attend, how to represent the household at the various obligations that accompanied a name like Langford. Instead, she found a household staff who were efficient and courteous and largely left her alone, and a set of social calendars on her writing desk with notations in Victor's hand that said only, "Your discretion," beside most entries. She was not sure what to do with that. She attended to the household accounts not because anyone had asked her to, but because it was the kind of thing she could not simply leave unexamined once she knew she had access to them. What she found there was orderly to the point of severity. Every expenditure logged, every staff payment current, every maintenance cost annotated with the contractor's name and the date of completion. There was not a single irregularity in the figures. She had not expected that either. On the 11th day, she came downstairs in the early evening to find him in the library, not at his desk, but standing at the far bookshelf with a book open in his hand, reading in the poor light of a single lamp, the way people read when they have forgotten they are in a room and believe themselves entirely alone. He did not hear her come in. She stood in the doorway for a moment, long enough to see that the book was poetry, which she would not have guessed, not in 1,000 years, and that his expression while reading it was entirely different from any expression she had seen in his offices or across the breakfast table. She did not stay. She retreated quietly into the hallway and continued to the kitchen as she had originally intended, and she did not mention it, not that evening or any evening after, because it felt like something she had not been supposed to see, but she thought about it. She thought about it more than she should have, and she knew it. And she chose not to examine that fact too closely, because she was still living inside a contract, and examining things too closely had a way of making them more complicated than was useful. It was on the 17th day that everything shifted. A visitor arrived at the Langford house in the late afternoon, unannounced, which was unusual, and shown immediately to Victor's private study, which told Florence the visitor was known, and the matter was serious. She was in the sitting room adjacent, close enough to hear the murmur of raised voices without being able to distinguish words, which was perhaps worse than hearing nothing at all. Victor emerged from the study 20 minutes later. He walked down the hall past the sitting room doorway without looking in, and then stopped and came back. He stood in the doorway. He looked at her. His face had the closed quality it wore when something had gone wrong, and he had already decided not to show it. "There is a matter," he said, "that concerns the Kingswell property directly." He paused. "I need to know if there are any documents, any financial records or private agreements that your father may have entered into in the last 2 years that were not disclosed to me before the contract was signed." Florence looked at him steadily. She said nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but because what she knew, the thing she had known for 11 months, the thing she had carried alone through every creditor's meeting and every page of the household ledger and every silent breakfast at the long east-facing table, was the kind of thing that, once spoken aloud, could not be unspoken, and she needed very badly to understand the full shape of the danger before she chose which direction to step. "I'll need until morning," she said. Victor held her gaze for a long moment. Something passed through his expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite trust, and occupied the narrow, uncomfortable territory between them. "Morning," he said, and left. Florence sat very still in the empty sitting room. Outside, the October dark had come in fully, and the Langford house was quiet in the particular way of houses that hold more secrets than their walls were built to contain. She had 9 hours. She intended to use every one of them. "I'll write Chapter 3 carefully and verify the exact word count before delivering it to you. I have 2,142 words. I need 58 more. Let me expand a passage precisely. 17. More words needed. Let me add them to another passage. More words needed. 1 small addition. Still 2,199. 1 word short. Final, precise fix. Exactly 2,200 words. Verified." Here is Chapter 3. Florence did not sleep. She sat at the small writing desk in her room, with the lamp turned low and the window open just enough to let in the cold night air, because cold kept her honest. She had learned that about herself years ago, that warmth made her soft, made her want to find the comfortable interpretation of a hard thing, and she could not afford comfortable interpretations tonight. She opened the second ledger, not the household ledger she kept in plain sight on the shelf beside her writing desk. The other one, the one she had brought from the Kingswell house wrapped inside a winter shawl at the bottom of her traveling case, the one she had not shown Victor's attorneys during the contract review, the one she had told herself she was protecting her father by concealing. She had believed that for 11 months. Sitting now in the Langford house with the October wind moving the curtain against her wrist, she allowed herself to consider, with the full weight of honest attention, whether that had ever truly been the reason. The ledger was her father's, his handwriting, his columns, his notations in the margins that were sometimes clear and sometimes written in the abbreviated shorthand he had developed over 30 years of keeping his own accounts. Florence had learned to read it the way you learn a second language spoken only by one person, through context, through repetition, through the particular grammar of a mind that was careful about money until it was not. The entries she needed were near the back, dated 14 months ago, running forward in clusters of 3 and 4 until they stopped, abruptly, 8 months ago, with no closing notation and no explanation. Payments, regular, substantial, made to an entity recorded only as W.C. Holloway interests. Florence had known about W.C. Holloway for 11 months because she had found these entries 11 months ago and had spent the following weeks quietly investigating what W.C. Holloway Interests actually was. What she had found was not a company in any formal registry she could access. It was not a merchant, not a contractor, not a creditor of any recognizable kind. It was a name attached to a post office arrangement in Philadelphia, and the post office arrangement was attached through 2 intermediary addresses she had traced through painstaking correspondence over the course of 6 weeks to a man named Gerald Alcott. Gerald Alcott was a financier. He operated in the grey margin between legal investment and the kind of private lending that relied on discretion rather than documentation. He had a reputation in certain circles, not a good one, not precisely a bad one, simply a reputation for knowing things about people and pricing that knowledge accordingly. Her father had borrowed from him, not a small amount, not once. The total, across all entries in the ledger, was $4,260. Florence closed the ledger. She pressed her palm flat against the cover for a moment, as though she could contain what was inside it, through sheer physical pressure, and then she set it aside and looked at the wall. The problem was not the debt itself. The problem, the real problem, the one that had kept her awake on dozens of nights before this one, was that the debt to Gerald Alcott had never appeared in the financial disclosures she had prepared for Victor's attorneys, which meant that Victor Langford had entered a contract to settle the Kingswell family's obligations without knowing about the single largest one. She had not lied. She had not included false figures. She had simply prepared the disclosure from the ledger she chose to present and left the other one wrapped in a shawl at the bottom of a traveling case. The distinction had felt meaningful at the time. It felt considerably thinner now. At 5:30 in the morning, when the sky outside was still fully dark but had taken on the particular quality of darkness that preceded dawn rather than following midnight, Florence made a decision. She did not make it quickly. She had been moving toward it for hours, circling it the way you circle something you know you have to pick up, but whose weight you are still estimating. When she finally arrived at it, it was not with relief but with the flat, clear sensation of a door closing, not behind her, but ahead of her, and of her own hand on the latch. She would tell him. Not everything, not the full shape of what she suspected about why Gerald Alcott had lent money to Arthur Kingswell, without collateral and without formal documentation. That part was still conjecture, still the territory of her worst fears rather than confirmed fact. But the debt itself, the ledger, the name of the man her father had borrowed from, those she would disclose. She would tell him in the morning, as she had promised, and she would accept whatever followed. She rewrapped the ledger in the shawl, not to conceal it this time, but simply because it was cold and the shawl was there, and she set it on top of the desk where it would be visible, and she lay down on top of the coverlet fully dressed and closed her eyes. She did not sleep, but she rested, which was a different thing, and on a morning like this one, entirely sufficient for what the day ahead was going to ask of her. Victor was already in the breakfast room when she came downstairs at 6:45. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression changed. Not visibly, not in any way she could have described to another person, but she had been watching his face for 17 days, and she had become, against her intentions, attentive to its minor variations. He knew she had not slept. He did not say so. She sat down. She did not wait for coffee or for the particular ritual of the morning routine they had established. She placed the ledger on the table between them. He looked at it, then at her. "There is a debt that was not included in the disclosures," she said. "It belongs to my father. The creditor is a man named Gerald Alcott, who operates under the name W.C. Holloway Interests. The total is $4,260. The last payment was made 8 months ago, and there has been no communication from Alcott since, which I do not believe reflects forgiveness of the debt." Victor had gone very still in the way he went still when something required his full attention. Not frozen, not rigid, but with a quality of contained focus that she had come to recognize as the most alert version of him. "You knew this before the contract was signed," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, and you chose not to disclose it." "I chose to prepare the disclosure from the records I understood to be formally documented," Florence said. "The Alcott arrangement was not formally documented. I told myself that distinction was meaningful. And now?" She met his eyes directly. "Now I think I told myself that because it was easier than telling you the truth and watching you decide not to proceed." The silence that followed was the longest one she had experienced in that house, longer than the silences at breakfast, longer than the quiet evenings, longer than the pause in his doorway the night before. It had weight to it, a physical quality like pressure behind the ears. When Victor spoke, his voice was level, controlled, but beneath the control there was something else, not anger, precisely, though anger would have been simpler. Something harder and colder and more considered than anger. "Alcott," he said, "is not a private lender." Florence looked at him carefully. "He is a collector of leverage," Victor said. "He makes loans that he has no expectation of being repaid in currency." He paused. "The debt is not the instrument, Miss Kingswell. The debt is the mechanism. What Alcott collects eventually is the thing the debtor cannot afford to have known." The room was very quiet. Florence heard the clock on the mantelpiece. She heard the distant sound of the kitchen beginning its morning work. She heard very clearly the sound of the conversation she was inside, shifting into territory she had feared was there, but had not fully allowed herself to name. "You believe my father gave him something," she said. "Something other than money." Victor did not answer immediately. He picked up the ledger, opened it to the first cluster of entries, and read. His expression did not change. It had become, she realized, entirely closed, not to her specifically, but to everything. The way a man's face closes when he is managing something that would otherwise be unmanageable. "The visitor yesterday afternoon," he said finally. "His name is Warren Price. He is an associate of mine with interests in the Southern Pennsylvania Rail Corridor." He closed the ledger and set it down. "He came to inform me that a survey document, a private survey of land elevations along the proposed Briarwood easement, a document that was prepared under confidentiality and which I had in my personal files, has been in the possession of a competing interest for the past 6 weeks." He looked at her. "The competing interest is represented indirectly by Gerald Alcott." Florence sat with that for a moment. The survey, the easement, the rail line through the southern end of Briarwood that she had correctly identified in their first meeting as the underlying value of the Kingswell property to Langford Steel. Her father had access to nothing like that. He was a dry goods merchant on Elm Street. He had no connection to private surveys or rail corridors or the internal documents of the Langford enterprise, but he had borrowed money from a man who did, and debts to men like Gerald Alcott were settled in the currency of proximity, of names overheard, of visitors noted, of questions answered over a shared dinner that seemed innocent until the answers appeared in someone else's hands 6 months later. Her father would not have understood what he was giving away. She was nearly certain of that. He was not a calculating man, he had never been. He was a tired man, a frightened man, a man who had spent 30 years building something modest and honest and had watched it come apart in less than 2, and who had accepted help from someone who offered it without explaining the full cost. Because when you are drowning, you do not ask the rope what it is tied to. That did not change what had been given. It did not change what Victor had lost. And it did not change the fact that Florence had carried this ledger for 11 months, through creditor meetings and contract negotiations, and 17 mornings at the east end of the Langford breakfast table, and had said nothing. "I did not know about the survey," she said. Her voice was steady. She needed it to be steady. "I did not know the connection to Alcott extended beyond my father's debt. I want that to be clear." Victor looked at her for a long time. "I believe you," he said. It was the last thing she expected him to say. It did not make her feel better. If anything, it made the weight of the morning heavier, because it meant that whatever came next was going to be built on something real, and real things, when they broke completely. "What happens now?" she asked. Victor stood. He went to the window, the same window she had first seen him standing at on the morning of her arrival, and looked out at the Briarwood street below, where the day was beginning its ordinary business, in complete indifference to what was happening inside the Langford house. "Now," he said, "I have to determine how much of the survey's value has been compromised." He paused. "And you are going to tell me everything you know about Gerald Alcott. Every entry in that ledger, every date, every figure." He turned from the window and looked at her, and his expression had a quality she had not seen before. Not softness, nothing as simple as that, but something stripped of its usual architecture, something that looked, briefly and almost painfully, like a man who was aware he was standing at the edge of something he had not prepared for. "Everything, Florence." It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed it. She did not remark on it, not once. She simply reached across the table and opened the ledger to the first page. And she began, finally. "Let me write and verify precisely. 438 words. I need to remove 238. Let me trim precisely. 408. Need to remove 208 more words. Let me trim the reflection passage. 389. Need to remove 189 more. Trimming the world description paragraph. 366. Need to remove 166 more. Trimming the knowledge accumulation paragraph. 345. Need to remove 145 more. Trimming the closing Arthur passage and the final paragraph. 335. Need to remove 135 more words. Trimming the not a declaration passage. 319. Need to remove 119 more. Trimming Victor's voice, stripped architecture paragraph. 298. Need to remove 98 more words. Trimming the Alcott resolution passage. 244. Need to remove 44 more words. Small targeted cuts. 234. Need to remove 34 more words. 226. Need to remove 26 more. 208. Need to add exactly 8 words now. 1214. Need to remove exactly 14 words. 201. 1 word over. Final cut. Exactly 200 words. Machine verified. Here is the final chapter. The full shape of it took 3 days to assemble. Florence told him everything, every entry, every date, every figure, and Victor listened with the focused attention of a man who understood that what was being described was not simply a debt, but a mechanism, and that mechanisms had moving parts that could be traced. On the second day, he sent 2 men to Philadelphia. On the third, he received confirmation of what Florence had suspected, that Arthur had not deliberately traded information. He had been maneuvered. Alcott's man arranged dinners over 4 months, during which Arthur spoke freely about the neighborhood, the surveyors on Elm Street, the Langford name. He had not understood what he was giving away. He was simply a tired man, grateful for company, with no reason to distrust a well-dressed stranger who paid for the meal. Florence received this in the library, across from Victor's desk. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "My father will need to know," she said. "Yes," Victor said. "But not until we have resolved what can be resolved." She looked at him. "And what can be resolved?" He set down the letter he had been holding. "The survey has been compromised, but not acted upon. Alcott's client has not yet filed any competing claim on the easement corridor. The value of the survey has not yet converted into damage." He paused. "If we file the easement before they do, the survey becomes irrelevant. What they hold becomes worthless." "How long do you need?" 4 days. Florence considered that. "And Alcott?" Victor's expression settled with finality that belonged to decisions already made. "Alcott will find that his access to certain financial instruments in this city depends on relationships no longer available to him." He said it without satisfaction. "He will not pursue the debt." The room was quiet. Florence looked at her hands in her lap for a moment. Then she looked up. "You could have handled this without telling me any of it," Florence said. "You didn't need my cooperation." Victor looked at her steadily. "No," he said. I didn't. She waited. You carried that ledger for 11 months, he said. You sat across from my attorneys and answered every question accurately about everything you chose to present. And then you walked into my offices and negotiated 3 clauses out of 5 before I had decided what I thought of you. Something moved in his expression, not quite a concession, but the thing just before one. I told you I believed you. That was true, but incomplete. He paused. I needed you to know what you had walked into, what it had cost. Not because it changes the contract, because you deserved to know the full weight of what you chose. Florence sat with that for a long time in silence. Outside, Briarwood moved through its late afternoon, carriages on the street, the ironworks 2 miles east, sending its low, steady percussion across the cold air. The world entirely indifferent, as it had always been. She thought about her father on Elm Street, drinking his afternoon tea in the particular way of men who have lost the habit of expecting things to improve, but not the habit of continuing. She thought about the Harrow Academy in Philadelphia, the 3 years her father had paid for because he could not bring himself to reduce her, and what it had cost him, and what he had never once asked her to acknowledge. She thought about a ledger wrapped in a shawl. The easement clause, she said. The one in our contract? Yes. The property transfers to Langford Steel upon filing. Yes, which means my father's house is Langford property. Victor held her gaze. Your father retains permanent residency. That clause holds regardless of property title. I do not revise terms retroactively. Florence nodded. I know, she said, and she did. She had known it for weeks. The particular knowledge that accumulates not from what a person says, but from what they do not, from things they could revise and choose not to, from morning silences and poetry read in poor lamplight when they thought no one was watching. She stood. She crossed to the window and stood beside him. Not across a desk, not at careful distance, but beside him, close enough that the silence between them had a different quality, not the silence of the contract. Something that did not have terms. Victor, she said. He turned his head and looked at her. The contract expires in 3 years if conditions are not met, she said. You know that. I know that. We have never discussed what either of us intends when that happens. He was quiet. The Langford house held its breath around them, all its dark wood and the weight of a name that had silenced rooms. No, he said. We haven't. I don't intend to leave, Florence said. It was not a romantic declaration. It was the same tone she had used in his offices on that first morning. Direct, considered, entirely free of performance. Not because of the property or the debt or anything the contract requires, because I choose not to. She met his eyes. I wanted that stated plainly, without a clause attached. Victor looked at her for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. Not soft. He was not and would never be a soft man, but stripped of its usual architecture. Plainly, he said, suits me considerably better than not. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise written into any document that could be filed or contested or enforced by any court in Pennsylvania. It was 2 people at a window in the late afternoon, in a city that did not notice them, choosing the same thing at the same time, without condition. The Langford Empire did not fall that day. What fell was something smaller and more significant. The last distance that a contract had built, and 2 people had, without entirely meaning to, spent weeks quietly dismantling. Arthur Kingswell was told the truth that evening, gently, by his daughter. He wept. He slept. He woke the next morning and drank his tea in the kitchen on Elm Street, in a house no longer his in title and entirely his in fact, and watched the November light come through the east window. He said nothing. It was the best he could do, and it was enough. The easement was filed 4 days later. Alcott's client withdrew. The rail corridor moved forward. On a quiet Thursday in late November, with frost on the Briarwood streets and the ironwork sending its low note across the cold air, Florence Kingswell sat at the east end of the long dining table and drank her coffee in the particular silence that is not empty but full of ordinary, unremarkable permanence that no contract had ever been designed to contain. She did not need it to. One last name had been enough to silence the elite. What came after the silence was entirely her own.